Every spring, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence releases its AI Index, a comprehensive audit of where the technology stands, where it's headed, and whether the institutions surrounding it are keeping pace. The 2026 edition arrived with a finding that cut through the usual metrics of model counts and compute budgets. AI capabilities are scaling faster than the governance systems, labor markets, and scientific institutions built around them can adapt, not slightly faster, structurally, categorically faster, in a way that the report's authors describe as a measurement crisis, not merely a policy lag. The numbers behind that conclusion are not projections, they are observations of things that have already happened. In 3 years, generative AI reached 53% of the global population. Personal computers required approximately 15 years to achieve comparable penetration. The Internet took roughly 7. No prior general-purpose technology has moved through society at this speed, and the infrastructure designed to evaluate, regulate, and absorb new technologies, the agencies, the standards bodies, the academic review processes, was built for timelines measured in decades, not years. Corporate adoption stands at 88%. 4 in 5 university students now use generative AI as a standard part of their academic work. These are not figures describing a technology on the horizon. They describe a technology already embedded in the daily operations of educational and economic life, while the frameworks meant to assess its consequences remain incomplete. The 2026 AI Index does not argue that AI is dangerous in simple or dramatic terms. Its argument is more structurally unsettling, that humans are deploying systems of rapidly increasing power without reliable tools to measure what those systems can do, what they get wrong, or what their presence inside human institutions actually produces over time. The instruments haven't kept up with the aircraft. That is the problem the rest of this report is built to describe. In 2024, Google's chief executive Sundar Pichai publicly celebrated a milestone. The company's AI had achieved 90% accuracy on a test called MMLU, the Massive Multitask Language Understanding Benchmark. The announcement was covered as a signal that AI had reached near-human expert performance across a broad range of academic domains. What was not covered is what one of the benchmark's own co-creators said about the test shortly afterward, that it was pretty fundamentally broken. That tension between the headline and the underlying reality sits at the center of the AI measurement crisis. Benchmarks are the primary tool researchers and policymakers use to assess AI capability. They are standardized tests, structured sets of questions or tasks with defined correct answers, administered in controlled conditions, scored against a human baseline. They are also, according to a growing body of expert opinion documented by outlets including the Markup and MIT Technology Review, increasingly inadequate for the thing they are supposed to measure. The first problem is saturation. GPQA, the graduate-level Google Proof Q&A benchmark, designed to test PhD-level scientific reasoning, was considered a credible upper-bound challenge for AI systems in early 2024. By late 2024 and into 2025, AI performance on GPQA had climbed to the point where the benchmark was no longer meaningfully discriminating between model generations. Researchers had to move on to harder tests. Those tests are now approaching the same ceiling. On SWE Bench Verified, a benchmark evaluating software engineering performance, AI scores rose from 60% to nearly 100% of the human baseline within a single year. The rate of saturation is itself a measurement problem. When a benchmark is exhausted, the instinct is to replace it with a harder one. But if the replacement is also saturated within 12 months, the field is not accumulating a coherent picture of AI capability. It is running a perpetual catch-up game in which each new instrument is obsolete before it generates longitudinal data. The second problem is structural misalignment. Benchmarks evaluate AI in conditions that do not resemble the conditions in which AI is actually used. A benchmark presents a single model with a single well-defined task and scores the response against a ground truth answer. A doctor using an AI diagnostic assistant, a software team integrating a code generation tool, a student submitting AI-assisted coursework. None of these interactions are isolated, single-step, or scored against a clean, correct answer. They unfold across time, inside organizations, between multiple people, with ambiguous success criteria. MIT Technology Review's 2026 coverage of the measurement gap identified this as a fundamental misalignment. AI performance in real-world conditions emerges from extended interactions within human systems. Benchmarks measure snapshots. The gap between those two things is not a calibration error that better benchmarks can fix. It is a design problem that requires an entirely different approach to evaluation, one the field has not yet built. What this means practically is that the benchmark scores cited in product announcements, regulatory filings, and policy documents are measuring something real, but not the thing decision-makers need to know. They describe performance on controlled tasks, not reliability inside human workflows. They establish that a model can answer a PhD-level chemistry question correctly in a test environment. They say nothing about how often that same model produces confident, plausible, and wrong answers when embedded inside a hospital system processing thousands of queries a week. Of the advanced AI models documented in the Stanford 2026 AI Index, more than 90% were developed by private companies. That figure was already high in prior years. What changed in 2026 is the direction of travel on transparency. OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, the three firms responsible for the most widely deployed large language models, have each moved toward withholding key technical details about their systems, including training data volumes, computational resources used in training, and the specific composition of datasets. This is not incidental. It is a strategic shift. As AI models become commercially central assets, the information that would allow external researchers and regulators to evaluate them independently is classified as proprietary. The result is a governance architecture with a structural flaw at its foundation. The entities with the authority to regulate AI increasingly lack access to the information required to do so. The concept of an AI audit, a formal, independent technical review of a model's capabilities, failure modes, and training provenance, is well established in policy discussion. The European Union's AI Act, which began enforcement in phases starting in 2024, mandates certain transparency obligations for high-risk AI systems. But enforcement depends on access to documentation that developers are not required to disclose in full, and the technical capacity within regulatory agencies to interpret what is disclosed remains thin. The U.S. AI Safety Institute, established in 2023 under the Commerce Department, was tasked with developing evaluation standards. By 2025, its operational scope and funding had become subjects of political contestation, limiting its ability to act as a counterweight to the pace of private sector development. The consequence is an asymmetry that compounds over time. Private developers accumulate technical knowledge about their system's capabilities and failure modes. Regulators, researchers outside those companies, and the public accumulate fragments, benchmark scores, technical reports written by the developers themselves, and occasional access agreements that provide limited visibility into specific aspects of specific models. The gap between what is known inside these companies and what is known outside them is not narrowing. It is widening at roughly the same pace as AI capability itself. There is a specific governance risk embedded in this dynamic that the 2026 AI Index flags directly. Declining transparency makes it harder to identify systemic risks before they materialize. A regulator who cannot examine a model's training data cannot assess whether that model has absorbed systematic biases that will produce discriminatory outcomes at scale. A public health agency that cannot audit a medical AI system's failure rate on edge cases cannot determine at what point deploying that system in emergency departments crosses from beneficial to harmful. The information required for those determinations is, in increasing measure, held exclusively by the developers of the systems in question. There is a category of AI risk that no current benchmark measures and no current regulatory framework formally addresses. It concerns not what AI does on a test, but what AI produces when it operates inside human institutions over extended periods of time. When an organization integrates a generative AI tool into its workflow, the effects that matter most, the changes in how decisions are made, how expertise is distributed, how errors accumulate, how accountability is assigned, unfold across months and years. A customer service team that routes 80% of initial inquiries through an AI system is not simply handling calls more efficiently. It is reorganizing how human judgment is applied, what skills remain practiced, and which atrophy, and where in the chain of interactions a consequential mistake is most likely to occur and least likely to be caught. None of those effects are captured by measuring the AI system's accuracy on a standardized response dataset. This is the blind spot that researchers associated with MIT Technology Review's 2026 coverage described as the central unaddressed problem in AI evaluation. The field has tools for measuring AI against individual humans on individual tasks. It does not have tools for measuring AI as an embedded component of human organizational systems operating over time. The economic consequences are also poorly quantified. Generative AI has been projected by institutions including Goldman Sachs and McKinsey to automate or substantially alter significant portions of knowledge work. Goldman's 2023 estimate placed 300 million jobs in the range of exposure. What has not been measured with comparable rigor is the second-order effect. What happens to organizational decision quality, institutional memory, and error correction capacity when large fractions of analytical and communicative work are delegated to systems whose failure modes are poorly understood and whose outputs are difficult to audit in practice? These are not hypothetical concerns flagged as future risks. They are current operational realities in companies across sectors. The measurement frameworks do not yet exist to track them systematically. Policy cannot respond to what cannot be observed, and what cannot be observed is precisely the layer of AI's impact that is most consequential over longer time horizons. When generative AI adoption reached 53% of the population within 3 years, the comparison that matters most is not speed for its own sake. It is the relationship between adoption rate and institutional adaptation time. Universities offer the clearest case study. By 2026, 4 in 5 university students reported using generative AI as part of their academic practice. This is not a fringe behavior or a policy violation being systematically ignored. It is the default. At most major research universities, the formal response, revised academic integrity policies, classroom guidelines, faculty training programs, lagged behind adoption by 1 to 2 academic years and remains in a state of ongoing revision. The educational infrastructure for teaching students when to trust AI outputs, how to verify AI-generated information, and what it means for professional competence when a tool can perform tasks previously used to assess that competence. That infrastructure does not yet exist exist in any coherent institutional form. The labor market presents a structurally similar picture. Economists and workforce researchers have documented that the occupational categories most exposed to AI-driven automation, legal research, financial analysis, certain categories of medical interpretation, software development, content production, are the same occupational categories that require the longest and most expensive training pipelines. A software engineer requires years of education and early career experience to develop productive professional judgment. AI tools that can perform entry-level software engineering tasks are now widely deployed. The cohort of humans who would have developed professional competency through that entry-level work is finding fewer opportunities to do so. The long-term effect on the depth of the professional talent pool is not measured by any standard labor market instrument. Regulatory agencies face a version of the same problem at the institutional level. The Federal Aviation Administration spent decades developing certification processes for aircraft and avionics systems before those systems were deployed in passenger aircraft. The Food and Drug Administration built multi-year clinical trial frameworks before approving pharmaceutical interventions. These processes reflect a principle that the pace of deployment should be constrained by the depth of understanding. That principle has not been operationalized for AI. In the United States, no federal agency currently holds the mandate, the technical staff, or the statutory authority to evaluate and approve general-purpose AI systems before deployment. The European Union's AI Act represents the most developed attempt at a regulatory framework, but its enforcement mechanisms are still being constructed, and its technical requirements for high-risk AI systems depend on documentation standards that developers are not yet uniformly meeting. The pattern across institutions is consistent. Adoption moves in years. Institutional adaptation moves in decades. The gap between those timelines is not a temporary delay that normal processes will eventually close. It is a structural feature of the current situation, and it grows wider with each additional wave of capability increase. The researchers who study AI evaluation are not passive about the failures they document. A coherent set of proposals has emerged in the technical literature and in venues including MIT Technology Review and academic AI safety conferences for what a next-generation benchmarking paradigm would require. The core shift is from task-level to system-level evaluation. Rather than measuring whether an AI model answers a question correctly in isolation, the proposed frameworks would measure AI performance as a component of human AI systems operating over time. This means embedding AI tools in realistic organizational contexts, with human participants performing realistic workflows across extended observation periods, with defined metrics for outcomes that matter, error rates on consequential decisions, distribution of accountability when errors occur, changes in human skill deployment, organizational resilience, when the AI component fails. Building this infrastructure is not technically intractable. It is institutionally and economically complex. It requires cooperation between AI developers, the organizations deploying AI, academic researchers, and regulatory bodies. It requires developers to allow access to systems under evaluation in ways that currently conflict with proprietary interests. And it requires the organizations deploying AI to participate in assessments that might surface uncomfortable findings about how the technology is actually affecting their operations. Precedents exist. Clinical trials for medical devices involve exactly this structure: longitudinal, multi-party, with mandatory disclosure of adverse outcomes. Aviation accident investigation operates through a model built on mandatory reporting and independent analysis that has produced, over 7 decades, a safety record in commercial aviation that would have been difficult to project at the industry's outset. Neither precedent transplants directly into AI governance, but both demonstrate that high-stakes technological deployment can be paired with rigorous, institutionalized evaluation, when the regulatory infrastructure is built to demand it. What does not yet exist for AI is the equivalent of the National Transportation Safety Board's investigative mandate or the FDA's clinical evidence requirements. Institutions with both the authority to compel disclosure and the technical capacity to interpret what they receive. Stanford's 2026 AI Index is, at its core, a document about the distance between where that infrastructure needs to be and where it currently stands. The AI systems deployed at scale in 2026 are performing at levels that most forecasters writing in 2022 would have placed several years further into the future. On PhD-level scientific problems, on complex mathematical reasoning, on software engineering tasks, AI performance has reached or exceeded human baseline levels across a widening set of domains, and done so faster than the measurement frameworks tracking that progress were designed to accommodate. That acceleration is not in itself the problem. The problem is acceleration combined with opacity, declining transparency from developers, measurement tools misaligned with real-world use, governance institutions without the authority or information to perform independent assessment, operating simultaneously. Each of those factors would be manageable in isolation. Together, they describe a situation in which the most consequential technology in current deployment is, in specific and documented ways, not fully understood by the people responsible for governing it, not accurately captured by the tools ostensibly tracking it, and not yet matched by institutions capable of absorbing its effects. The 2026 AI Index ends not with reassurance, but with precision. The gap is documented. The nature of the gap is understood. The tools to close it are not yet built.